Minneapolis, Minnesota, February 1936. While the city's wealthy bundled into their coal-heated mansions and the working families huddled around cast-iron stoves that devoured their wages, 15-year-old Thomas Halverson was doing something that made absolutely no sense to anyone who passed by. He was building a home beneath the 10th Avenue Railroad underpass, where the wind howled through like a frozen tunnel, and respectable people crossed the street to avoid the shadows. The structure didn't look like much from the outside, just salvaged railroad ties, discarded bricks, and what appeared to be several tons of dirt and sod piled against the underpass's north wall in a strange, sloping mound that rose 12 feet high and extended 23 feet along the concrete foundation. A single wooden door, painted an incongruous, cheerful blue, stood at the center of what looked like an earthen burrow that belonged more to a prairie dog than a human being. "That Halverson boy is building himself a grave," Edgar Whitmore announced at the 3rd Ward Relief Committee meeting, his voice carrying the smug certainty of a man who'd never missed a meal. Someone should tell him that the city doesn't pay to bury vagrants who freeze to death in public spaces. When that pile of dirt collapses on him, or when February really hits and he's found stiff as a board, don't expect the taxpayers to foot the bill for a pauper's funeral. But Thomas had no intention of freezing, and he certainly had no intention of abandoning the one piece of shelter he'd managed to claim in a city that had made it abundantly clear there was no place for orphaned Norwegian boys with no money and no connections. He had spent 8 months learning from his grandmother Astrid before the pneumonia took her in June, and she had taught him that the American way of fighting winter with mountains of coal and wood was like trying to bail out a sinking ship. You could never bring in resources fast enough to match what the cold stole away. Before we continue with Thomas's remarkable story, I want to know, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this story of a teenage boy who survived Minnesota's deadliest winter in an earthen shelter when mansions failed around him, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to this channel for more incredible stories of ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things. Your support helps us bring you more amazing true stories, like this one. Now, let's get back to Thomas's story. Thomas still remembered the good years before everything fell apart. His grandmother Astrid had lived with them in the small house on Cedar Avenue, and on winter evenings after his parents finished their shifts at the mill, she would sit by the kitchen stove and tell him about the old country, about the turf houses built into hillsides that stayed warm all winter with nothing but body heat and a single oil lamp. She would describe how her grandfather's home was cut into the south face of a slope, how the earth itself became the walls, how the grass grew on the roof and sheep grazed there in summer. "The Americans, they think we were poor and stupid," she would say in her thick accent, her knobby fingers working her knitting needles. "But we were warm, Thomas, warm all winter while using less fuel in a month than these Americans burn in a day. The earth does not steal heat like wood and brick. The earth holds it, keeps it, gives it back." His father would laugh gently and say that this was America now, that they had coal and modern ways, but he always said it kindly, and Astrid would smile and continue her knitting. Then came the influenza in January 1934. His father died on a Tuesday, his mother on Thursday, both of them burning with fever in the Methodist hospital, while Thomas sat in the hallway because children weren't allowed in the sick wards. He was 13 years old, and by the end of that week, he was an orphan. His father's brother, Uncle Carl, took him in, but the man had never liked Thomas's father for marrying a Norwegian woman instead of a proper German one, and he liked Thomas even less. Carl owned a small construction business that was barely surviving the Depression, and he made it clear that Thomas earned his keep, or he could sleep in the street. For 18 months, Thomas worked on job sites, carrying bricks and mixing mortar, watching Carl's crew build houses the American way. Thin wooden frames, hollow walls, single layers of brick that looked solid but were just shells around empty air. He watched families spend half their income on coal, watched children sleep in coats because the bedrooms farthest from the stove were too cold to use, watched Carl charge desperate people premium prices for repairs when pipes froze and chimneys cracked. Grandmother Astrid lived alone in a boarding house after the funerals, and Thomas visited her every Sunday, bringing whatever food he could smuggle from Uncle Carl's pantry. She was fading. He could see it. But her mind was still sharp, and she seemed to know that her time was short. She stopped talking about the past as memories and started talking about it as lessons. She drew diagrams on brown paper, showing him how to angle a dwelling into a slope, how to calculate the depth needed for Earth to maintain steady temperature, how to create ventilation that wouldn't bleed away heat, how to use thermal mass to store warmth during the day and release it at night. "You will need this, barn, she said, using the Norwegian word for grandson. "This country is rich now, but I have lived long enough to see that richness is a tide. It comes in, it goes out. When it goes out, the people who know how to live with little will survive. The ones who need much will suffer." She died in June 1935, and Thomas discovered that she had been 3 months behind on her boarding house rent. Her landlord took everything she owned to cover the debt: her furniture, her clothes, her knitting, even the brown paper diagrams. Thomas managed to salvage only one thing: a small wooden box containing her knitting needles, a photograph of her grandfather's turf house in Norway, and a leather journal where she'd written, in her careful handwriting, detailed instructions for building a torvus, an earth-sheltered dwelling. Uncle Carl found the journal 2 weeks later and threw it in the stove. "You're not filling your head with peasant nonsense while you live under my roof," he said. "Your grandmother was a relic. This is America. We build with lumber and brick, like civilized people." But Thomas had already read the journal 3 times, and he'd memorized most of it. The final break came in August. Thomas suggested during a job site meeting that a client worried about heating costs might benefit from building into the slope of their property rather than on top of it, using the earth as insulation. Uncle Carl backhanded him across the mouth in front of the whole crew. "You make me look like a fool," Carl said, his face red. "Telling my customers to live in holes like animals. You're done. Pack your things and get out." Thomas left with the clothes on his back, 2 blankets, a canvas tarp, Astrid's wooden box, and the knowledge that he would have to prove her teachings or die trying. He spent 3 weeks sleeping in doorways and under bridges, doing odd jobs for pennies, searching for a place where he might build something without being immediately run off. The underpass at 10th Avenue was perfect precisely because it was worthless to everyone else. The railroad owned the land, but they didn't care about the garbage-strewn margins beneath the tracks. The neighborhood was poor enough that no one was planning development. The ground was rocky and sloped, considered unbuildable. The wind that funneled through the underpass was legendary. Locals called it the ice tunnel and avoided it all winter. But Thomas saw what others missed. The underpass itself was a concrete arch, and the north wall had a natural slope of earth piled against it from decades of runoff and debris. The location was a wind tunnel, yes, but only in the open air. If you could get below ground level and behind mass, the wind became irrelevant. The slope faced south, which meant maximum sun exposure in winter. The concrete wall would act as a heat sink during the day. The railroad tracks above provided a roof that would never leak or collapse. The rocky soil that made the land worthless for conventional building was exactly what he needed: well-draining, stable, and full of thermal mass. He spent 2 weeks just watching. He noted when the sun hit the slope and for how long. He watched where snow accumulated and where it melted first. He observed the wind patterns, how the gusts came in from the northwest, but created a dead zone right against the north wall. He checked after rainstorms and found that the ground drained quickly, with no pooling or erosion at the slope's base. On September 15, 1935, he began to dig. The conventional approach to foundation in Minnesota was to dig below the frost line, 4 feet down, and pour concrete footings. Thomas had no concrete and no money to buy it, but he also didn't need footings because he wasn't building up. He was building in. He started by excavating backward into the slope, removing earth in a rectangular shape 8 feet wide, 12 feet deep into the hillside, and 7 feet high at the back wall. He didn't remove the earth with a shovel and cart it away like a conventional builder would. Instead, he piled most of it in front of and on top of where the structure would be, creating exactly the kind of earthen burrow his grandmother had described. The technique was called berming, and it worked on a principle so simple that most American builders had forgotten it existed. Earth is the best insulator that exists in nature, and it's free. Air conducts heat rapidly. That's why balloon frame walls, those hollow American designs that were nothing but wood studs with empty space between them, bled warmth like sieves. Stone and brick conduct heat even faster, which is why brick buildings feel cold and need constant heating. But earth, especially thick earth, conducts heat so slowly that at depths below 3 or 4 feet, the temperature stays relatively constant year-round, usually in the 45 to 55 degree range, regardless of whether the surface is baking or freezing. Thomas dug his back wall 7 feet into the hillside, which meant that wall was touching earth that would never freeze, never fluctuate more than a few degrees. He used salvaged railroad ties, which the railroad company discarded by the dozen, to create a sturdy back wall and 2 side walls that angled slightly inward as they came forward. Each tie was 8 feet long and 10 inches thick, massive pieces of creosote-treated lumber that would never rot and could support immense weight. He stacked them log cabin style, cutting interlocking notches with a borrowed handsaw, creating walls that were not just 10 inches thick but solid wood, no hollow spaces, no air gaps. 3 weeks into the work, word had spread through the neighborhood. The vagrant boy under the 10th Avenue Bridge was building something, and it looked insane. Edgar Whitmore arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with 2 of his associates from the relief committee, men in wool coats and felt hats who looked like they were inspecting a circus curiosity. Thomas was working on the roof structure, laying salvage planks across the tops of his railroad tie walls. "Boy," Whitmore called out, his breath steaming in the October air. "You're building a tomb." Thomas climbed down from his work, wiping his hands on his trousers. He was thin from months of irregular meals, his face still showing the last softness of childhood, but his hands were calloused and his eyes were direct. "No, sir," he said politely. "I'm building a home. With railroad ties and dirt." One of Whitmore's associates laughed, a sharp bark of sound. "Son, that pile is going to collapse the first time we get a heavy snow. The weight will crush you in your sleep, if the cold doesn't get you first." "The cold won't get me," Thomas said. "The earth holds heat at 50 degrees year-round at this depth. I'm building into the thermal mass, not fighting it." "Thermal mass?" Whitmore repeated, his tone mocking. "Where'd you learn that? From some hobo university under a different bridge?" "From my grandmother, who lived 73 winters in Norway in a house that used less fuel in a year than a Minneapolis family uses in a month." "Well, this isn't Norway, and you're not building a proper house." Whitmore gestured at the structure with contempt. "This is America. We have standards, we have building codes, we have civilization. When the city inspector sees this eyesore, he'll condemn it. And when you freeze to death because you're too stubborn to go to a proper shelter, don't expect anyone to shed a tear. We've all tried to help you, boy. You're the one who insists on being difficult." "The only help I need," Thomas said quietly, "is to be left alone to finish my work." "You'll finish it all right," Whitmore said, turning to leave. "By Thanksgiving, you'll be finished, frozen solid, and we'll drag what's left of you out and dump you in Potter's Field. Mark my words." Thomas watched them walk away, then returned to his roof. The roof was the most critical element and the most technically challenging. A conventional roof was built to shed water and snow quickly, which meant steep angles and lightweight materials, shingles, tar paper, thin wooden slats. But a steep exposed roof in Minnesota winter was a massive source of heat loss. All that warm air that rose naturally would hit the cold roof surface and lose its heat immediately. And the temperature difference would cause constant condensation, ice dams, and structural stress. Thomas's roof design, drawn from his grandmother's journal, worked on the opposite principle. Instead of trying to shed snow quickly, it was designed to hold it. Snow, like earth, was an excellent insulator. Each inch of snow added roughly R1 of insulation value, and a thick layer of packed snow could add R10 or more. His roof was nearly flat, sloped at only 15 degrees, just enough for water to drain, but not so steep that snow would slide off. He laid down the salvaged planks, then covered them with several layers of canvas tarp he'd purchased with money, earned from 3 weeks of washing dishes at a diner. Over the canvas, he placed a layer of clay-rich soil, which he packed and smoothed to create a waterproof barrier. Finally, he covered the clay with 2 feet of regular earth and planted it with prairie grasses that would root and hold the soil in place, creating a living roof. The whole structure, when complete, would be invisible from most angles, just a grass-covered mound against the underpass wall with a single blue door. And that door was the only significant opening, no windows. Windows, no matter how well built, were thermal disasters. Glass conducts heat 20 times faster than a well-insulated wall. His grandmother's people had lived through dark winters with tiny windows or none at all, using oil lamps, and accepting the darkness as a reasonable trade for warmth. Thomas planned the same. He would have his door, a small ventilation shaft, and that was all. But he wasn't building in complete darkness. The concrete underpass wall itself, which formed the back of his dwelling, faced south. All day, from sunrise to sunset, that concrete absorbed solar radiation. Concrete, like all masonry, has high thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. By building his structure against that sun-warmed wall, Thomas was creating a passive solar heating system that would pump gentle warmth into his dwelling all night long, warmth that the earth walls would trap and hold. The ventilation system was the detail that showed Thomas had truly understood his grandmother's teachings. He couldn't seal himself in completely. Humans need fresh air, and combustion of any kind needs oxygen. But conventional ventilation, like windows, was a heat loss disaster. Most homes had gaps, cracks, drafts that constantly exchanged inside and outside air, which meant constantly reheating cold air. Thomas built an earth tube. He salvaged a 10-foot length of 6-inch clay drainage pipe and buried it 3 feet deep, running from the outside air to a point that emerged inside his dwelling near the floor. Air traveling through that underground pipe would be warmed by the earth surrounding it. Outside air at 0 degrees would enter the pipe, travel 10 feet through 50-degree earth, and emerge at maybe 40 degrees. Still cold, but far less of a shock than direct 0-degree air, and much easier to warm the final distance. The warmed air would enter near the floor, rise as it heated further from his small heating source, and exit through a simple wooden shaft that ran up through his roof, creating natural convection flow. The whole system would provide fresh air constantly while minimizing heat loss. By mid-November, the basic structure was complete. Thomas had hauled and placed approximately 12 tons of earth, piece by piece, working 10 to 14 hours a day. His heating plan was simple: a small Swedish-style masonry heater that he built from salvaged bricks in the corner. It was not a conventional fireplace, which was basically a hole in the wall that sent 85% of heat straight up the chimney. A masonry heater had a serpentine internal flue path that forced hot gases to wind through several channels of brick before exiting, which meant the bricks absorbed the heat and radiated it slowly over many hours. He could burn a small, hot fire for an hour, using perhaps 5 pounds of wood, and the brick mass would radiate warmth for 12 to 18 hours afterward. He was living in it by Thanksgiving, and that's when he began keeping records, because he knew that no one would believe him without numbers. On November 28, 1935, the outside temperature was 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Thomas burned 6 pounds of scrap wood in his masonry heater for approximately 1 hour. The interior temperature, measured with a thermometer he'd purchased from a hardware store for 15 cents, stabilized at 58 degrees and remained there for 16 hours. He used a total of 6 pounds of fuel to maintain comfortable temperature for 16 hours. His Uncle Carl's house, by comparison, went through roughly 50 pounds of coal per day to heat a space only 3 times larger, and the temperature in Carl's back bedrooms still dropped into the 40s at night. Thomas's fuel efficiency was approximately 8 times better per square foot than conventional heating, and his interior temperature was more stable. There were no cold spots, no drafts, no morning chill. The thermal mass of the earth walls absorbed warmth during the day and released it at night, creating a gentle, even temperature that required only slight adjustments. He made his living through odd jobs that took advantage of his reputation for reliability. He shoveled snow for shopkeepers, hauled trash, washed dishes, split wood, did any work that paid. People found him strange, but they also found him dependable. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't disappear on payday. The money he earned went toward food, lamp oil, the occasional clothing repair, and a small stockpile of scrap wood for his heater. He spent perhaps 1/10 of what a conventional household spent on heating, and he was more comfortable. December brought the first real test. Temperatures dropped into the single digits and stayed there for a week. Thomas burned his small fires and tracked the results. Outside temperature, 4 degrees. Inside temperature, 54 degrees. Fuel consumption, 8 pounds of wood per day, burned in 2 brief fires, morning and evening. The Earth itself was doing most of the work, holding steady at its natural 50-degree baseline, while the masonry heater added just enough extra warmth to bring the space into human comfort range. One afternoon in mid-December, Thomas was returning from a dishwashing shift when he noticed someone approaching his dwelling, not in the aggressive way that Whitmore had, but tentatively, curiously. It was Michael Chen, a young journalist who wrote for the neighborhood newsletter and was known for his interest in how immigrant communities survive poverty with techniques that mainstream society ignored. "Thomas Halverson?" Chen called out. Thomas nodded, wary but not hostile. "I've heard stories about what you built here. People say you're living in a dirt pile and staying warm all winter with almost no fuel. Mind if I see for myself?" Thomas considered, then nodded. "All right." He opened the blue door, and Chen followed him inside. Thomas watched the journalist's face change as the warmth and stillness of the interior registered. Outside, the wind was cutting, the air frigid. Inside, it was still and gentle, the walls radiating a steady, pervasive warmth that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "What temperature is it in here?" Chen asked, his voice quiet with surprise. Thomas pointed to the thermometer hanging on the wall. 56 degrees. Outside is 12. "And what are you burning?" "I burned about 4 pounds of scrap wood this morning. I'll burn another 4 pounds this evening. That's it." Chen walked slowly around the small space, running his hand along the earth walls, touching the brick of the masonry heater, examining the wooden ceiling. "This is ingenious," he said finally. "You're not fighting the cold at all. You're hiding from it." "My grandmother said that fighting nature is a losing battle," Thomas replied. "You work with what's there. The Earth wants to be 50 degrees year-round. I just let it." "Can I write about this?" Thomas shrugged. "You can write whatever you want, but I doubt anyone will care." Chen smiled slightly. "You might be surprised." The article ran in the neighborhood newsletter on December 20th, a small piece describing the Norwegian Earth home under 10th Avenue. It was respectful but skeptical, noting the unconventional design and Thomas's claims about heating efficiency but stopping short of endorsement. Thomas received a few curious visitors over the next weeks, mostly immigrants from cold climate countries who recognized the traditional approach and nodded with approval. The mainstream community, including Edgar Whitmore and the Relief Committee, ignored it completely. January 1936 arrived cold and stayed cold. The temperatures were brutal, dropping into negative numbers regularly. By mid-January, the cold had already killed 6 people in Minneapolis, 3 homeless, 2 elderly people whose coal rations ran out, and 1 child whose family's heating stove failed in the night. If you want to find out how Thomas's underground dwelling saved the lives of 16 people during the coldest recorded blizzard in Minnesota history, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what this 15-year-old boy built would shelter more than a dozen desperate people when temperatures dropped to 42 degrees below zero, and conventional homes became death traps. And then, one afternoon in late January, Thomas was splitting wood behind his dwelling when he looked up and saw Edgar Whitmore approaching through the frozen streets, walking unsteadily, his face gray with cold and exhaustion. Thomas straightened, surprised. Whitmore had been the loudest voice predicting his death, the most certain that this earth shelter was a grave waiting to happen. Now, here he was, looking diminished and desperate in a way that Thomas had never seen on a relief committee member. "Boy," Whitmore said, and his voice was hoarse, "how cold is it inside your place?" "About 53 degrees right now," Thomas said. "I'll bring it up to 57 this evening." Whitmore stared at him. 53 degrees, right now, with the outside temperature at -8. "Yes, sir." "And how much fuel are you using?" 5, maybe 6 pounds of wood a day." Whitmore was silent for a long moment. Then he said something Thomas never expected to hear from him. "I need to learn how you did this." "Why?" Thomas asked, not hostile, just genuinely curious. "Because I've burned through 3 weeks of coal rations in 10 days trying to keep my house above 40 degrees. My wife is sick. My youngest has frostbite on his toes from sleeping in his bedroom. I've spent more on heating in the last month than I spent on rent. And you're standing here comfortable in a dirt hole, using scrap wood." Whitmore's face twisted. "I was wrong about this, about you, and I need to know how to keep my family from freezing." Thomas studied him, seeing the genuine fear behind the pride, the desperation that had finally eroded the man's certainty. He thought of his grandmother, who had always shared her knowledge freely, who had said that wisdom hoarded was wisdom wasted. "I'll show you," Thomas said. "Come inside first. Warm up." Whitmore followed him through the blue door, and Thomas watched as the man's entire body seemed to sag with relief as the warmth enveloped him. Whitmore stood there, eyes closed, just breathing, and Thomas understood. The man had been cold for weeks, truly cold, the kind of deep chill that gets into your bones and won't leave. And now, for the first time in a long time, he was genuinely warm. "How?" Whitmore asked, opening his eyes. Thomas showed him everything: the depth of the earth walls, the thermal mass principle, the insulated roof, the earth tube ventilation, the masonry heater design. He showed him his fuel consumption logs, the temperature records, the measurements that proved this wasn't luck or wishful thinking, but simple physics applied correctly. "The problem," Thomas explained, "is that American houses are built to look impressive, not to work efficiently. Thin walls, big windows, tall ceilings, all of that looks good, but it's terrible for keeping heat. Earth doesn't look good, but it works. Mass doesn't look impressive, but it holds temperature steady. You can't fight winter with fuel. There's not enough fuel in the world to win that fight. You have to work with the earth. Let it do most of the work for you." Whitmore listened, asked questions, took notes on a small pad of paper he pulled from his coat pocket. When he finally left, 2 hours later, he paused at the door. He didn't apologize. Thomas suspected the man wasn't capable of that. But he said, "I'm going to tell people about this. The committee, the churches, people who need to know." "All right," Thomas said. The weather forecast for late January was ominous. The radio spoke of an Arctic front of unprecedented strength, with temperatures expected to plunge to record lows and winds that would make exposed skin freeze within minutes. The city mobilized emergency shelters, but there weren't nearly enough beds for all the people who would need them. The blizzard arrived on January 27th, 1936, and it was worse than anyone had predicted. The temperature dropped to minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest temperature ever recorded in Minneapolis. The wind howled at 40 miles per hour, creating a wind chill that weather services didn't even have numbers for. Snow fell so thick and fast that visibility dropped to zero. The city essentially stopped. Schools closed, businesses closed. Police told people over the radio to stay inside, burn whatever they had, and pray their houses held together. In conventional homes across Minneapolis, families burned furniture, books, anything combustible, trying to keep temperatures above freezing. Pipes burst throughout the city as the cold overwhelmed insulation. Coal furnaces ran at maximum capacity and still couldn't keep up. The heating system at St. Joseph's Hospital failed, and patients had to be evacuated in the middle of the blizzard. By the end of the second day, 37 people were dead from cold-related causes, and the number was still climbing. Michael Chen, the journalist who had written the article about Thomas, lived 8 blocks from the 10th Avenue Underpass. When his building's furnace cracked from the temperature stress and the temperature in his apartment dropped to 15 degrees, he remembered Thomas's earth shelter and the steady 56 degrees he'd felt inside. He bundled himself in every layer he owned and fought his way through the blizzard, expecting to find Thomas's dwelling collapsed or buried or simply empty, the boy frozen somewhere. What he found instead was the blue door, slightly drifted with snow but intact, and a thin wisp of smoke coming from the ventilation shaft. He pounded on the door, and Thomas opened it, dressed in a simple wool shirt and trousers, looking comfortable and utterly calm. "Come in," Thomas said, pulling Chen inside quickly to minimize heat loss. Chen stumbled into the space and stopped, overwhelmed by the simple, impossible fact of warmth. The walls radiated it. The floor was warm under his frozen feet. The air was still and gentle. He looked at the thermometer. 59 degrees. "It's 59 degrees in here," Chen said, his voice cracking. "Outside is minus 42. The cold only goes down about 4 feet, Thomas said calmly. "Below that, the earth doesn't care what the surface temperature is. I burned a little extra wood this morning because the ventilation tube was bringing in colder air than usual, but the structure itself is doing most of the work." Chen's worldview, his understanding of how shelter and survival worked, shattered in that moment. He had lived his entire life believing that fighting cold meant massive inputs of fuel and technology, that survival meant constant consumption, and here was a 15-year-old orphan in a hole dug into a hillside, more comfortable than anyone in the city. "How many people could fit in here?" Chen asked. Thomas looked around his small dwelling, doing the math. "It's about 90 square feet. Safely? Maybe 12 people standing, fewer if they need to sit or sleep. Why?" "Because I know at least 6 families in my building who are going to freeze to death tonight if they stay where they are," Chen said. "And I'm betting there are more in the neighborhood who need shelter. Can we bring them here?" Thomas didn't hesitate. "Yes, bring them." Over the next 4 hours, Chen and Thomas made trip after dangerous trip through the blizzard, spreading word through the neighborhood that there was warm shelter under the 10th Avenue Bridge. They brought back Mrs. Kowalski and her 3 children, whose heating stove had run out of coal. They brought back the elderly Mr. Yamamoto, who lived alone and was too proud to go to a public shelter. They brought back the Martinez family, 5 people whose apartment had lost all heat when their building's furnace died. They brought back others, a young couple with a baby, 2 teenage boys who'd been sleeping in a church basement, a woman whose husband had gone to the hospital and hadn't returned. By midnight, there were 16 people crowded into Thomas's 90-square-foot earth shelter. It should have been unbearable. Too many bodies, too little space, air quality terrible. But the earth walls kept working. The ventilation system kept working. Thomas burned a larger-than-usual fire in the masonry heater, and the brick mass absorbed and radiated the warmth. The body heat from 16 people, which would normally have been lost to thin walls and drafty windows, was captured by the thermal mass and held. The thermometer read 64 degrees. Outside, the blizzard raged at -42. They stayed for 3 days, taking turns sleeping and sitting, sharing the small amount of food that people had brought, melting snow for water, and simply surviving. Thomas moved through the crowded space calmly, tending the heater, checking the ventilation, answering questions about how the structure worked. The children, after their initial fear subsided, were fascinated. One of the Kowalski boys, maybe 8 years old, asked, "Why doesn't the cold come through the walls?" "Because the walls are thick," Thomas explained, "and made of earth. The cold wants to move from outside to inside, but it takes a long time to travel through 4 feet of dirt. By the time it gets through, the air inside and my little fire have already warmed things up." Mrs. Martinez, who had been skeptical and frightened when they first arrived, ran her hand along the earthen wall and said quietly, "My grandfather in Mexico built houses like this, adobe, half buried in hillsides. I thought it was just because they were poor. I never realized it was brilliant." On the morning of the 3rd day, the blizzard broke. The temperature rose to -10, which felt balmy by comparison, and the wind died down. People began to leave, returning to their homes to assess damage and check on loved ones. Chen was one of the last to go, and he paused at the blue door. "I'm writing about this," he said to Thomas. "Not just the neighborhood newsletter. I'm sending this to the Tribune, the Journal, anyone who will publish it. The city needs to know what you did here." "I didn't do anything special," Thomas said. "I just built what my grandmother taught me." "You saved 16 lives," Chen replied. "In the deadliest blizzard in Minnesota history, using ancient techniques and scrap materials, you created the warmest, safest shelter in the city. That's not nothing, Thomas. That's extraordinary." The article appeared in the Minneapolis Tribune on February 5th, 1936, with the headline, "Teenage Orphans Earth Shelter Survives Record Cold." It described Thomas's design in detail, included his temperature logs and fuel consumption data, and featured interviews with several of the people who had sheltered there during the blizzard. The response was immediate and significant. Thomas received visits from architects, university professors, city planners, and dozens of ordinary people who wanted to learn the techniques. Edgar Whitmore came back, this time with humility replacing his earlier contempt, and spent 2 weeks learning the principles under Thomas's patient instruction. He built an earth-sheltered addition to his own home, berming the north and west walls and installing a masonry heater, and his fuel costs dropped by 60%. He taught others, and they taught others. Over the next 3 years, Thomas consulted on the construction of 47 earth-sheltered dwellings in Minnesota and surrounding states. He never charged for his knowledge, though he accepted payment for his labor when he helped with actual construction. He remained living in his original shelter under the 10th Avenue Bridge, which became something of a pilgrimage site for people interested in sustainable building. The railroad company, recognizing the positive publicity, officially granted him permission to remain on the land indefinitely. By 1939, Thomas's techniques had been studied and documented by the University of Minnesota's Department of Architecture. His approach was recognized as a practical application of principles that indigenous peoples across cold climates had developed over millennia: the partially underground homes of the Inuit, the turf houses of Iceland and Norway, the earth lodges of the Mandan people. Modern science confirmed what Thomas's grandmother had known intuitively: that earth-sheltered buildings with high thermal mass could maintain comfortable temperatures year-round with minimal energy input, that thermal mass stabilizes temperature fluctuations, that earth tubes precondition ventilation air, that masonry heaters are up to 90% efficient compared to conventional fireplaces at 15%. Thomas lived in his earth shelter for 23 years. He married Lily Chen, Michael's younger sister, in 1942, and they raised 2 children in a larger earth-sheltered home they built together on the outskirts of the city. Thomas worked as a consultant and builder, helping design energy-efficient homes during an era when energy was cheap and efficiency was unfashionable. He never became wealthy, but he never struggled either. His own fuel costs remained minimal, his homes comfortable, his techniques proven. His beloved dog, a mutt named Gustav, who had wandered into his life in 1938, died in 1952. Thomas buried him on the hillside near their home and planted a young oak tree as a marker. The tree still stands, massive now, its roots running deep into the earth that Thomas understood so well. Thomas died in February 1968 at the age of 47 from a heart attack. By that time, the techniques he had pioneered had been incorporated into dozens of sustainable building projects across the northern United States and Canada. His original shelter under the 10th Avenue Bridge, built in 1935 with salvage materials and immigrant knowledge, was still structurally sound. His funeral was attended by more than 300 people. They came from across Minnesota and beyond: architects and builders, families who had sheltered in his dwelling during the blizzard, students he had taught, colleagues he had worked with. His son, Daniel, delivered the eulogy. "My father was 15 years old when the world told him he would freeze to death," Daniel said, his voice steady despite his grief. He was an orphan with no money, no tools, no support, living in a space that respectable people wouldn't even walk through. But he had something more valuable than any of that. He had knowledge passed down from his grandmother, who learned it from her grandfather, who learned it from generations before. He had the courage to trust that knowledge even when everyone mocked him. And he had the generosity to share what he learned freely, never hoarding it, never profiting from others' desperation. My father built a home that saved lives when conventional wisdom failed. He lived simply, taught patiently, and proved that the best solutions often come from listening to the wisdom of those who came before us, from working with nature instead of against it. Rest now, Father. Grandmother Astrid is waiting, and the earth you loved will hold you gently, as it always did. Today, the original earth shelter still stands beneath the 10th Avenue Railroad Bridge, now protected as a historic site by the Minneapolis Park Board. It's been modernized with electricity and updated ventilation, but the core structure, the railroad tie walls, the earth berm, the living roof, the concrete thermal mass, remains exactly as Thomas built it in 1935. Visitors come from around the world to see it, to step inside and feel the steady warmth that requires no fuel, no technology, just earth and knowledge and careful design. On the hillside near the house Thomas built with Lily, 3 memorial stones stand together. The largest reads, Thomas Halverson, 1920-1968. He taught us that warmth comes not from what we burn, but from what we build with wisdom. The second, smaller stone, reads, Astrid Halverson, 1862-1935. She carried the knowledge across an ocean and gave it to her grandson. The third, smallest stone, reads, Gustav, 1938-1952. A faithful friend who shared the warmth. The blizzard of January 1936 tested an assumption that had gone unchallenged in American building for generations, that the way to survive cold was to build tall, impressive structures and fill them with massive amounts of fuel. That fighting nature with consumption was the only viable strategy. Thomas Halverson proved that wrong, not with theory or argument, but with a thermometer and a fuel log and the simple, undeniable fact of his survival and comfort when everything conventional wisdom predicted should have killed him. The principles he used were ancient, developed by cultures across cold climates over thousands of years. The sod houses of Iceland, the earth lodges of the Mandan and Hidatsa peoples, the partially buried homes of the Inuit, the cave dwellings of central China's Loess Plateau, where millions still live in earth-sheltered homes that maintain steady temperatures year-round. These weren't primitive solutions born from ignorance. They were sophisticated applications of thermal dynamics, developed through centuries of observation and refinement by people who couldn't afford to waste resources and didn't have the luxury of being wrong. Modern building science has confirmed what Thomas's grandmother knew intuitively and what indigenous peoples worldwide demonstrated through their architecture. Earth at depths below 3 to 4 feet maintains a relatively constant temperature regardless of surface conditions, typically in the 45 to 55 degree Fahrenheit range in northern climates. Materials with high thermal mass, like earth, stone, and masonry, absorb heat slowly and release it slowly, creating stable interior temperatures with minimal energy input. Earth tubes and similar earth-coupled ventilation systems can precondition incoming air, reducing heating and cooling loads by 40 to 60%. Properly designed earth-sheltered buildings can maintain comfortable temperatures year-round with 70 to 90% less energy than conventional structures. Thomas succeeded because he was willing to question the prevailing orthodoxy, to trust knowledge that mainstream society had dismissed as primitive. He had nothing when he started, no money, no connections, no formal education, no support. But he had observation skills, patience, willingness to learn from the past, and the courage to build something the experts said would fail. What the city of Minneapolis built with millions of dollars, schools, hospitals, office buildings, failed during that blizzard. Heating systems broke down. Structures couldn't maintain temperature. People died in buildings that were supposed to protect them. What a 15-year-old orphan built with salvage materials and immigrant knowledge not only survived but thrived, providing more comfort and safety than any conventional building in the city. There's a powerful metaphor in that contrast, about the difference between extraction and stewardship, between imposing human will on nature and working within natural systems. Thomas didn't conquer winter. He didn't fight the cold with overwhelming force. He simply built a space where winter's power couldn't reach him, where the earth itself did the work of protection. Thomas never became famous in his lifetime. He never wrote books or gave lectures to large audiences. He never sought recognition or wealth. He simply lived, raised his family, helped his neighbors, and taught freely when people asked to learn. The 47 earth-sheltered structures he helped build during his lifetime sheltered hundreds of people over the decades, providing warmth and safety with minimal fuel consumption when conventional homes failed during cold snaps and fuel shortages. Most of those original structures are gone now, replaced by modern buildings as neighborhoods change and developed. But the knowledge survives, carried forward by students and colleagues, preserved in university archives, practiced by a growing community of builders interested in sustainable, low-energy design. And the original shelter, that 90-square-foot earthen burrow under the 10th Avenue Bridge, still stands as a testament to what's possible when wisdom, necessity, and courage converge. So here's the question for you. What abandoned space exists in your life? What dismissed resource or forgotten knowledge has everyone written off as worthless or outdated? What might happen if you looked at your challenges the way Thomas looked at that concrete underpass and rocky hillside, not as limitations but as opportunities, not as problems to overcome with brute force, but as systems to understand and work within? If this story resonated with you, if it made you think differently about sustainability, about questioning mainstream approaches, about the value of traditional knowledge, hit that like button to help others discover this story. Share it with someone who needs to hear this message about how ancient wisdom and careful observation can outperform modern technology. Leave a comment about what spoke to you or what you learned. And subscribe to this channel for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things through patience, observation, and the courage to trust knowledge that others dismissed. Because sometimes the best shelter isn't purchased with money or built according to code. Sometimes it's the one you create with your own hands. Using wisdom passed down through generations and the understanding that nature is not an enemy to be conquered, but a system to be respected and worked with. Thomas Halverson understood that at 15 years old, and he proved it in the coldest winter Minnesota had ever seen, saving 16 lives when conventional wisdom failed all around him.